Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of our course Cultural Governance in the Modern Middle East. Today we will be talking about archaeology and imperial power. So as I hope I've established in the first 2 weeks of the course, one of the central issues in heritage management during this period, the late Ottoman period, is that Western states competed with Ottoman nations in the control of Middle Eastern material heritage. Today we're going to be looking at the period around World War I to World War II, what's often called the interwar period, and this saw the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of post-Ottoman states like Iraq, Syria, and of course Turkey. And this trend of competing over the ownership of Middle Eastern material heritage continued. So we're going to look at this through two angles. First, the ownership of antiquities as a competition for cultural heritage, and second, the production of knowledge on the Middle East. A lot of knowledge in this period on the Middle East was created in the West. And so often you have American, British, German, and other European scholars writing books on Middle Eastern history and culture, which obviously is a little bit problematic. And this production of knowledge, which we'll look at today, mirrored increased efforts to acquire antiquities, and increased engagement of these states with the West. And so in other words, the West really heightened, increased its production of knowledge on the Middle East as the Middle East became a larger player on the international stage. So production of knowledge reflected kind of foreign policy and political aims. First, I'd like to tell you about this really interesting case study from the beginning of the First World War. In 1914, Portugal intercepted a ship in Lisbon that carried Mesopotamian antiquities, so artifacts from Iraq, excavated by Germany that were bound for Berlin. A lot of players in this case study might be a little confusing, but Germany conducted excavations in Iraq, specifically at Babylon, and then they shipped these antiquities around Portugal with the goal of going to Berlin. But with the outbreak of World War I, German ships became enemy ships for the Allied powers, and Portugal intercepted the ship. So Portugal, Britain, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire all sought to establish ownership over the antiquities that were in the ship. And I will explain sort of the motivations behind all of these countries claiming the antiquities at the same time. You can see on this map Lisbon in red, Berlin in blue, and Baghdad in yellow, just so you can have an idea of the space involved. And there's a really interesting article that was written on this case study. I'll provide the link in Google Classroom so you can read it if you're interested. So we had 4 countries all claiming ownership over the antiquities: Portugal, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, which would later be Turkey, and Britain. But how did they justify these claims? So Portugal first said, we intercepted enemy ships. Therefore, we have the right to retain these antiquities as spoils of war. Germany said that the antiquities were from our excavations and that they were German ships. And as we will see, this issue wasn't fully resolved until after the First World War. And so they considered, because the excavations were before the war, the issue wasn't resolved until afterwards. We're the ones that excavated the antiquities. They should be sent to Berlin. The Ottoman Empire said that the antiquities should not have been removed from Iraq, which at the time was under the Ottoman Empire. And so thank you, Portugal, for seizing the ship, but they should be returned to us. Specifically, they would go to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. And Britain, finally, said that they should have the antiquities, that they were the best equipped to conserve and preserve them, and that London would be a great place for them to get lots of visitors. This is a similar argument to what we saw with the Parthenon marbles. Alternately, Portugal, you could return them to Iraq, which would shortly come under the British mandate. So after the Ottoman Empire broke up after World War I, several countries in the Middle East that were a part of the Ottoman Empire now became mandate territories that were awarded to European countries like Britain and France, with the intention that the European country would guide Iraqis, Syrians, Lebanese people into forming governments, holding elections, and eventually becoming independent states. So Iraq would come under the British mandate. So if the antiquities were sent back to Iraq, it's essentially like they were being sent to Britain. They would still be under British control. So in the end, Germany agreed to establish a museum in Portugal and donate to it 600 antiquities from around the world in exchange for Portugal returning the Babylonian collection to Berlin. This is an image of Babylon in Iraq. It took 12 years to resolve the dispute, finally concluding in 1926, with the antiquities held in Lisbon Harbor the entire time. This is the article. If you would like to read more about the case study, I will post the article on Classroom as well, Google Classroom. And according to the author of this article, instead of the antiquities ending up in Berlin, what should have happened is that they should have gone to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, because they were removed from the Ottoman Empire in violation of antiquities protection legislation, because at the time it was against Ottoman law to export antiquities from the empire without explicit permission. And so this is a really interesting case study that shows the overlap of heritage management, cultural governance, and international politics during a really volatile period, the First World War. So another way that heritage management and politics have overlapped, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, is in the production of knowledge. So research on another region. And after the First World War, there was a rise in what's called area studies, which is research that focuses specifically on one geographic region. And of these area studies, the Middle East was an increasingly popular subject, because following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, we had all of these new states that, while many of them were under mandate administration by European powers, everyone sort of, academics, politicians, average people in the West trying to figure out what this new country is, everyone is trying to create some foundation of knowledge on which they can create legislation, political interests, commercial interests, tourism, antiquities, exchange agreements, things like this. And so this represented a desire to consolidate scholarship on key regions, kind of figure out what's going on, especially the Middle East, and it's shaped by history from below, which is a really interesting and valuable concept. This is the study of history through normal people. A lot of scholarship, historical scholarship up until this point, focused on the rise and fall of empires, the lives of great men, and it kind of ignored social processes, cultural identity, ground level politics, and so historical work after this period started to use a lot more diversified sources. They used newspapers, legislation, interviews with normal people, poetry, graffiti, to create a more, you could say accurate, but definitely more nuanced history of the Middle East, which focused less on well-known names and major events. So a lot of research in the US on the Middle East was funded by foundations. Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Getty, and these 4 examples were industrialists from the 19th and 20th centuries, whose discoveries and capital success led them to accumulate extreme wealth. And many of these men, Getty, Gulbenkian also, later took some of this wealth and invested it into cultural programming, and the collection of antiquities. So this image on screen shows the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, which some of you might be familiar with. If you're interested in learning more about Getty, I would recommend the movie All the Money in the World. It's very interesting. And it's a true story about how J. Paul Getty, his grandson, was kidnapped in Italy, and he refused to pay the ransom. His logic was, I didn't get this rich by giving money away. Very interesting movie. And I would also, if you're interested in the antiquities trade, I would recommend The Medici Conspiracy, which is a book based on true events. The Getty Museum became embroiled in scandal at the end of the 20th century and in the early 21st century because it was found that they sourced a lot of their antiquities from illegal excavations and looting in the Middle East and in Italy and Greece. So this is very interesting. The ways that capital, like massive amounts of capital, have overlapped with Middle Eastern research and the collection of antiquities. So part of the reason that these men invested in cultural programming, charitable foundations, and museum collections was to improve negative public image about them and their immense wealth. These men really passed the threshold of how much money it was thought that a single person could have. John D. Rockefeller in this picture was the wealthiest man who had ever lived up until, I believe, last year. I think that Elon Musk has since passed him. But there was a hugely negative public image about these men. It was believed that their wealth was based largely on exploiting people or the environment. And they also, these men, Getty, Rockefeller, wanted to try and avoid really heavy taxes from the governments, their governments. Of course, when you get into this tax bracket, the taxes would be immense. And if you funnel that money into charitable endeavors or foundations, you don't have to pay taxes on that money. And so there were a number of reasons why they opened these foundations. It was also a response to social transformations occurring in the US. Again, with the rise of area studies, people were becoming more interested in the heritage of other regions. And so these foundations pursued research, connected the public with antiquities and research on other regions. Another major funder of cultural research were oil companies. They financed study centers and training programs abroad and worked very closely with the American government because they combined oil wealth, experience in the region and networks in the region, and shared interests. They were generally aligned with the goals of the American government with a need for trained American personnel. And what's really interesting is that many of the students of these study centers and training programs later went on to become spies, either for the American government or for other Western European governments, or for the oil companies themselves. If you're interested in learning more about this, feel free to email me or make a post in the Google Classroom, and I will be happy to recommend you some books or articles where you can read more about it. This is just one example of cultural research and programming meant to push certain values. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was founded by the CIA and which promoted American values in Middle East and North African countries. So I just want to close our lecture by giving you this kind of jam-packed slide that shows several books that have been written, most of them since 2003, which, as many of you will know, I'm sure, was the American invasion of Iraq. Most of these books were published after this, when there was really another surge in interest in the Middle East, specifically Iraq. These books are largely written for a general public, so they're meant to educate the average person in the West. And the average Westerner, their interest was piqued following the events of 9/11, the rise of ISIS, and the American invasion of Iraq. And so after the First World War, this rise in area studies and desire to understand the other, this isn't a one-time thing. This happens periodically. During the Vietnam War, for instance, there was a lot of scholarship emerging about Vietnam to kind of understand the other. There's a lot of research now on Russia, obviously because of the war with Ukraine. And so the production of knowledge really reflects foreign policy aims and international politics. And there's a lot of this scholarship that's based on heritage and heritage management, using antiquities to reflect power imbalances. That is it for this week. Thank you so much. And congratulations, because you are now halfway through the course. As always, you can email me or post to Google Classroom if you have any thoughts about this lecture or any questions. Next week, we will be revisiting the topic of ceremonies and festivals, and we're going to focus on the 1971 Persepolis Festival in Iran, which celebrated the 2,500-year anniversary of the founding of the Persian state. So please read this article, and I would strongly recommend you watch this movie. It's called The Shah of Iran's Ultimate Party on YouTube. It's very interesting. You can watch it with your friends, and let me know what you think. So thank you, and I will see you all next week.